debate and discourse, as vitally important to our work and to the larger project of democracy as they are, music has the power in many respects to go so much deeper. And so sort of Omni-American style movement that I want to see in American society cannot exist without an accompanying soundtrack, I believe. And that is part of the premise now of our work at Braver Angels.
Join us for Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast. Today, we're proud to present a conversation with John Wood Jr., the National Ambassador of the Braver Angels organization, very important civic organization that you'll hear more about. John discusses his background, his familial background, his religious and spiritual background, and connects that to the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who's an icon for him, and counterposes that to the anti-racist philosophy that is so au courant today.
In addition, John comes from a very rooted American family. You don't come across American families on both sides with such a interesting genealogy. His father was a jazz musician. His mother was an R&B singer. And when you put it all together, you get this really interesting mix of a thoughtful, musical, civic-minded, omni-American individual who I enjoyed speaking with, and I look forward to hearing more from him in the future.
Welcome to Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast. Welcome to the show, John Wood Jr.
Well, it's great to be on, brother, and great to see you, Greg, and you, Aryeh. And we've got to get this phrase "Omni-American" the proper recognition that it deserves. And so this podcast is definitely a step in the right direction. Good to be here.
Hey, Greg, that is by far the greatest opening we've had of any guest. I mean, that's music to our ears right there.
It certainly is, which is why when we did our first virtual award ceremony and the organization you represent, Braver Angels, was one of our promotional partners, we so appreciated. So why don't we start there? Tell us about your work and role with Braver Angels.
Well, I'm more than happy to do that. So I'm national ambassador, yes, for an organization called Braver Angels, which is the country's largest grassroots cross-partisan organization dedicated to the work of what you could call political depolarization, but what I like to deepen by saying is really the work of reviving the communal fabric of American democracy. And so, as you know, gentlemen, we live in a historically polarized moment in time for all sorts of reasons that, of course, we can go into. But it's no mystery that as a consequence of the fact that the American people find themselves tribalized along these lines of political ideology in ways that are not just differences of opinion, but amount to zero-sum contests, conflicts of identity. Not only are our institutions shaking in their ability to respond to the needs of the American people, but we're faltering in our ability to just stay in relationship with each other, right? The data on this is clear and undeniable. You go back 50 or 60 years, people didn't care if your kids married somebody from the other party. Now, the majority of parents would be somewhat aghast if their Democratic son or daughter were to marry a Republican or vice versa, right? Thanksgiving dinners in 2016 were on average 45 minutes shorter than they were the year before that, simply because people couldn't stand to talk about Trump and Clinton. So Braver Angels work exists to minister to these divides really on every level of society. There's a suite of workshops and other programs that we use to be able to help facilitate in-person communication, in-person connection, help people share their experiences, to humanize their differences, even if it doesn't allow them to necessarily see eye to eye on politics and policy. And, this is the type of thing that we do in Congress, college campuses, online programs, and through digital media content, even using art and music and a little bit of jazz in various formats to help open people's senses to different points of empathy and communication, connection with people who think differently than they do. But we are fundamentally a grassroots organization with work that we do in local communities. We've got about 13,000 members across the country, about 100 or so local bipartisan alliances. You can think of them as local Braver Angels chapters. and much, much more. So, it's an ambitious enterprise that seeks to breathe life into the idea of the beloved community, and I think is very much in the spirit of the Omni-American ethos, in my personal and humble view.
That's great. I'm very interested in what you mentioned, that there's much data to support this, and then you made the claim that there is, if you marry someone from the other political party or other political ideology, that is there actual data on that? Because
I was interested in the data on how do we know when are people finishing their Thanksgiving dinner?
I'm sure these are all things that are self-reported from surveys and questionnaires. And forgive me, if you guys give me till after the show, I can provide you with the direct links of those.
No, that's fine, because and I mean, the reference is I want some specifics, but what struck me as very interesting is that if you look at historically in the United States, what's called interracial marriage, and the objections to that, and the relative lack of objection to that now, struck me as a very interesting contrast with what you are claiming is if you marry someone from the other political party or political ideology.
Well, that's precisely correct. And the irony is right in the contrast you're identifying. Because if you rewind the clock, and usually when these statistics and polarization are presented, they're presented in contrast to similar survey data that was taken in the 1960s, which then indicated that while only about, I may not have it exactly right, but I believe that while only about 3 to 5% or so of registered Republicans and Democrats expressed any distaste at all at the idea that their children might marry somebody of the other party. 3 to 5%, something very marginal. Back in the early 60s or so, it was interracial marriage, but also marriage outside of religious denomination. If you were Protestant, the idea of your child marrying a Catholic, for instance, or vice versa. These were things that about half or more of Americans could not abide. And in today's America, that is completely flipped. We no longer care really too much at all in general, as a statistical matter, about interracial marriage. I mean, yeah, sure, obviously you have people who cling to that still. But or even marrying outside of religious denominations so much, but marrying outside of your political camp, that's a bridge too far for what might be a majority of parents at the moment. So yeah, that data is worth calling to the surface. But as a general phenomenon of social prejudice, it's completely flipped from mid-century to now.
Wow.
So it's interesting to think about this flip. It makes one wonder if people need to constitute themselves by having some sense of definition that they define themselves in light of something oppositional. And I'm sure when you're dealing with your groups, you come across this and you explore this. But I'm wondering, to go back to what you said earlier, thought-provoking, I'd like to hear more. How do you integrate jazz into your work? How do you integrate music? And I think you said opening up people's senses to be able to listen and be more receptive. How does that work?
So there are a few ways that we do this, but innovating new approaches or seeking to innovate new approaches all the time. On the one hand, music is a part of our general culture at Braver Angels. And so at various events that are otherwise oriented perhaps around dialogue or debate or general meetings, we will sometimes have music sourced from within the Braver Angels community used to sort of open up the ceremony, open up the event. We don't do that all the time, but Braver Angels has had an sort of a semi-annual tradition of a songwriting contest where we solicit submissions from members and subscribers across the country from various musical genres that have whether it's folk music or anything else, has a message that one way or another shines some light on the larger project of humanizing across differences, or just tells a story that's derived from a distinct cultural or social point of view that's presented in a way that is dignified and accessible and artistically inspiring to folks that may or may not actually vibe with that genre or the politics behind it. And so we see this sort of music at various places in Brave Our Angels communal life, if you will, because we are really a community distributed across geography as well as ideology. We come together in our national conventions, and music is stitched through the sequence of events in a major way, culminating in a big concert at the end of 3 days of debates, and discussions, of all sorts of other things. And in this past year, our headline act was a group called Gangsta Grass, which is a hip-hop bluegrass fusion group with a distinctly sort of working class appeal. So reach across ideology, reach across party. But then we also have workshops that are really about getting people to explore substantively difficult and polarizing issues through the actual work of songwriting, through collective songwriting, bringing together liberals and conservatives to actually write a song, let's say about abortion or something, that is able to capture their differences, capture their perspectives, but give life to that in artistic terms, and through something that is mutually created and given birth to by people who might have deeply, deeply polarizing disagreements over that topic. And so on all these different levels, music is a big and increasingly bigger part of Brave Angels' culture and method for impacting the nation.
Wow, that is so great to hear in terms of, especially, all of it, but the last in particular strikes me as not only very creative, but you're talking about writing lyrics. It's like writing poetry in order to confront issues in a way that, as you said, is creative, but also that allows people to express their point of view. And it seems to me, perhaps find a way to see a common thread of concern or values. Would you say that's the case?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's a way in which you might not believe a slick talker like myself, Greg and Aryeh, if I'm telling a story about, trying to find political common ground or whatnot. You might think, oh, you're pulling my leg if you're telling me you vote Republican, but you've got some common ground with me as a progressive. But I think it's rather more difficult to distrust the authenticity of a sincerely delivered song, if you will, something that's clearly written from the heart. It's music by its very nature tends to penetrate to the depths of sincerity. It works because it communicates something undeniably real about the quality of the heart and the soul. And that's what it means to be transcendent, really, to communicate something powerful enough to go beyond the aesthetic package of the person delivering it, And so music has the power to accomplish what debate and discourse, as vitally important to our work and to the larger project of democracy as they are, music has the power in many respects to go so much deeper. And so, the sort of Omni-American style movement that I want to see in American society cannot exist without an accompanying soundtrack, I believe. And that is part of the premise now of our work at Brave Our Angels.
And you're speaking our language for sure. If we can take one step back on that plane, tell me more. How did I guess this would be a great aural, AURAL, a great sonic metaphor for America. How did the bluegrass hip hop mesh go? How did that work?
Oh, that was incredible. I mean, just Gangsta Grass is an incredibly dynamic group. I encourage you to look up their stuff. They've got an international following. Somebody described them as when the hood meets the woods. This is what you get. So, I mean, there's a way in which, just to put it in crass political terms, I mean, they kind of speak for MAGA and BLM in some sense. I mean, it sort of represents that kind of excuse me, that kind of a cultural crossing. But yeah, I mean, imagine, a group like this up on stage at the Braver Angels convention doing like bluegrass covers of like Tupac songs while like old heads from the American Enterprise Institute get up and dance. I mean,
That's quite an
almost
image.
it's almost like a step into sort of like the Marvel multiverse kind of realm of American politics. It's like you've entered a twilight zone where a lot of the same categories exist,
Right.
but people are singing and dancing together across these divides and vibing in a way that you would just never see represented in the mainstream media.
This is what the anthropologists call a liminal space, where you create a space where the hierarchies break down and the identities kind of dissolve and people participate in the shared space. That's very interesting. But Greg, I think you had something you want to say.
Well, speaking of liminal spaces, I would say that in some ways your own background crosses the liminal space of race. And so why don't you tell us a bit about your personal background? And we're going to get back to music because you also are connected as a musician, so feel free to integrate all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of have to integrate all of it to give you an appropriate answer to the question. So, yeah, or at least this platform gives me an easy opportunity to do that. So, but I guess I'll start that off in the way I usually do, by sort of rewinding the clock, not all the way to my appearance on planet Earth, but to my 2014 campaign for Congress. And so of course, I was a nominee for Congress. I was a Republican nominee for Congress, as a matter of fact, in 2014, the youngest active nominee in the state of California, running against Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who you may have heard of at some point. I had no reputation. I had no money or anything like that. I came completely out of nowhere in the political scene in LA and California, as far as people were concerned. But I was able to gain some serious attention in the district. But the district is largely black and brown, largely left leaning, of course, but does have pockets of conservatives in the suburban county areas. And so whether I was speaking to a black Democratic leaning church in South Central Los Angeles or a white Tea Party club in suburban LA County, people would tend to ask me questions like, well, what at the age of 26 makes you qualified to represent a district as diverse and complex as the California 43rd? And I would tend to respond to that by saying, well, I have an interesting family background. My mother is a liberal black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father is a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my mother to my father and my father to my mother, and that's why I can represent all of you. So, it tended to be good for a laugh. Now, the truth is that my family, my parents separated when I was pretty young, although both were, staple pillar parts of my life from then till now. But it was music that brought my family together, and it's music that is really the background that I come from most predominantly. My father's a jazz musician, jazz pianist, who played and recorded with some of the greats in West Coast jazz, names like Billy Higgins and Joe Henderson and Woody Shaw, many others. Nat Hentoff, Leonard Feather, I think both wrote liner notes for my father, wrote about my father's music at varying points. My mother is an R&B singer, played her music on the radio in LA, stations like KGLH for a long time. And she used to dance on Soul Train back in the late 70s or so. Yeah, that's right. Don Cornelius, cold fried chicken. She tells us all those stories. One of my uncles was a big gangster rapper, as a matter of fact, in the 90s. I called him Mac 10. He was part of the West Side Connection, which was Ice Cube's group after he left NWA. And that was an appalling reality for my dad, who always liked my Uncle Dedrick, but hated hip-hop and gangster rap. My father believed that technology, this is its own thread, but that technology, that America was great. He raised me with the very Make America Great Again philosophy. But it was about going back to when American popular culture was great. And in my view, in my dad's view, American popular culture started to decline with the with the introduction of multi-track recording in about 1970 or so, which in his view ultimately culminated in the rise of disco and hip hop and terrible pop music and gangster rap, which was the worst of all things. But my father and my mother met in my grandfather's recording studio with my dad, where he was engineering hits for groups like New Edition and Paula Abdul and LL Cool J and all these folks who came through the studio. All music my dad hated. But that's where he met my mother. It was my grandfather's recording studio, and who my grandfather was the president of the biggest independent record label in America back in the 1950s. As a matter of fact, owner and founder of a label called Dot Records, which happened to boast artists such as Pat Boone, Lawrence Welk, Gail Storm, the Del Vikings, Louie and Keeley, all sorts of other folks. Billy Vaughn had 36 million sellers. Now, Grandpa was a white man, but before that, before Dot Records even, he started a mail order record shop, which sponsored a radio show by the same name called the Randy's Record Shop, which was the first radio show in America to broadcast rhythm and blues and gospel music to a national audience. And really it launched the careers of folks like Arthur Alexander and Fats Domino and Solomon Burke and Mahalia Jackson.
Wow.
And so that was the world that my father grew up in, and it was against that backdrop of the life spent in the epicenter of popular American music during what my dad, considers to be the glory days of American popular culture, that his view of the world was formed, and that ultimately, led to him meeting my mother, and it sort of led to me being raised with the storyline, which basically said that, as my dad is fond of saying, good music unites Cobra and Mongoose, right? Good music powered the civil rights movement. It was good music that made American culture really the envy of the world. So say what you will about that as a single factor explanation for all things, but it has always been in the backdrop of my existence that as vital as politics is, as vital as democracy is, there's this invisible substratum to a healthy society, which is found in its art and the power and capacity of art to transcend the things that otherwise divide us. So, that's sort of bringing all the threads together into sort of culturally, politically, and artistically what makes me me.
That was fascinating and beautiful. And for our viewers and listeners, some of our viewers and listeners were sufficiently intelligent that they, listening to John, did not have this question. I, however, had this question, so I'll ask it for all of you. What was your father's name? I would like to remind all of you we're speaking with John Wood Jr.
Right. Was and still is John Wood, or John Wood Sr. after I came.
Right, there you go.
So yeah, if anybody's interested in looking up his stuff, feel free. Now, the thing about my dad is that he's so, my dad is so kind of opposed to technology's influence on culture that he really is grossly distrustful of the internet. And as a consequence of that, you can't really find too much of his stuff uploaded anywhere. I mean, he himself would never do it. Some people do, right? But Dad used to make music-themed and low-technology advocacy-themed, as he would say, T-shirts and bumper stickers. So some people remember him because of this. One bumper sticker in particular was very popular. It read, "Drum machines have no soul." I don't know if you guys ever copped that one. But he sold a couple 100,000 of those without the internet in the early 2000s, and it popped up in movies like American Pie, Band Camp, and his reality show, which had a theme song that said "Drum machines have no soul," which I think was clearly inspired by the sticker and many other things. And so, yeah, that's my Omni-American starting point.
That's cool,
right
man. And, it's so interesting that the soul keeps coming up in this conversation, and throughout our second season, first season too, but second season in particular, the soul has been a key theme running throughout our conversations because it's so important. Now, what about you? as a musician?
Hmm. Well, I was raised a musician. I was raised a jazz trumpet player. Also raised a vocalist. Really, I play the trumpet. I sing. I even rap a bit. You get me on stage, I can do some things. I have never vocationally been a musician. However, I mean, I played concert band, jazz band, through high school and whatnot. I've actually written a fair amount of music that I've never actually published, which I should. But the thing is when you grew up in a family like mine, you had to be able to do music just to sort of survive. My brother Evan Wood is probably the most extraordinary clarinetist in the world. I mean, and he mostly plays as a performer. He himself doesn't record too much, but he is an absolute prodigy.
Wow.
And you could put him on the bandstand with any woodwind player you could imagine on the planet, and he would do more than hold his own.
Wow.
I have a cousin singer songwriter named Natasha Wood who does wonderful folk style music and Latin jazz sort of things a little bit. She's an incredibly dynamic artist herself, and so music is a very important thing to me in every level, including the practice of music. But it's never been a vocation for me. But that might still change. I might get drummed out of politics and public intellectual life at some point. If I do, I've always got the horn to fall back on.
So it's interesting. I mean, you at least have, if you don't still, I'm not sure, been the host of a program. Can you tell us the name of the program and the station on the West Coast? And I have a reason for asking it because I want to get back to your positioning politically, at least when you ran for office 10 years ago. Tell us about your show.
Sure. So thank you for that question. So I'm host of a radio show called The Reconstruction Project that airs in Los Angeles on KBLA 1580. It happens to be the only Black-owned talk radio network west of the Mississippi River, owned and founded by Tavis Smiley, who, of course, you gentlemen are familiar with, and many of your listeners will be as well. So that is The Reconstruction Project on KBLA 1580 in LA.
So do you still consider yourself a Republican and conservative? How do you describe yourself politically today, particularly as a national ambassador of an organization that is particularly focused on decreasing political polarization?
Right. Well, I certainly am the token Republican on that network. It was a very progressive network overall. My colleagues tend to be very well to the left. Although, one thing I'll say about Tavis is that as much as you have the stereotype about sort of left-leaning thinkers and ideological people being unwilling to entertain thoughtful conversations or debates, Tavis is adamantly not that way. I mean, he will show up to any conversation and listen with good faith and engage on the wider range of issues very thoughtfully. So we have a great chemistry on that front. I do consider myself conservative, and I'm still a registered Republican. I will admit to you, gentlemen, that I have not actually voted Republican on the presidential level, at least, since 2012, and I only was old enough to vote in one cycle prior to that. And in that election, I voted for Barack Obama because at the time, I very much considered myself a liberal Democrat. That's actually the way I looked at myself growing up. And I should say about my father, though I described him as a conservative Republican from the South, today my dad is a major Donald Trump supporter, and he was a supporter of the Tea Party prior to. But my dad was a Democrat for most of his life. Our family were Kennedy Democrats, and my father was one of those folks who felt like the Democratic Party left him behind. And so, sort of as we got into the Obama era and whatnot, my dad threw up his hands with the Democratic Party for a number of reasons. He'd sort of been a bit of a lukewarm Democrat for a while anyway. And, I think kind of held on maybe for Al Gore's sake a little bit, because the Gore family and the Wood family were both Tennessee families. And my grandfather was good friends with Al Gore Sr.
So how did you, John, transition from being as a self-described liberal Democrat to becoming a Republican?
I was very much inspired by the Obama campaign in 2008. I saw a good deal of myself in Barack Obama, not merely because of his biracial origin story, but because I think, like myself, Barack Obama was somebody who, when you read Dreams from My Father, when you read The Audacity of Hope, through his own particular multicultural experience, came to a point of view which said that there is deep, redeeming goodness across the wider spectrum of cultural and ideological identities in American society that he could testify to, in part, just from his own familial and social upbringing. And he wanted to activate a recognition of that in American politics. That's what I wanted to see, because my anchoring hero back when I was liberal, and now someone who thinks of himself as a classical conservative in the mold of a Russell Kirk, which is a little bit different from calling oneself a Tea Party conservative, much less a MAGA conservative, or even perhaps a Reagan conservative, although I've got plenty of admiration for Ronald Reagan, et cetera. But I saw in Barack Obama echoes of the transcendent philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr. This idea that in seeing our country as not merely red states or blue states, not a Black America, white America, or Latino America, but the United States of America, that Obama had a transcendent vision of our country and its people that echoed the higher idealism that I associated with Martin Luther King Jr. And so I threw myself into Obama's campaign, and in an effort to further the movement for hope and change in America, I began to study conservatism and Republican thinking much more deeply than I had done before. And so I started reading books that I had never read before, things like Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand. I really got much more. My father raised me listening to conservative talk radio even before he went right, but I started paying much more attention to the likes of Larry Elder and Dennis Prager, and started consuming a fair amount more Fox News, and just really considering the arguments I was hearing on every level. What was also happening at the time, I should mention, because it was probably equally important, I experienced something of a religious conversion, because I grew up really thinking of myself as sort of secular agnostic, even though I had certain kinds of, curious thoughts about spirituality, but very much opposed to organized religion, and even had a bit of a distaste for Christianity as a sort of as an institution in cultural life. But then I met a woman from a traditionally Black Baptist background who I worked with at a fundraising center where we were raising money for the Democratic Party. And we would have these sort of, I liked her, she was gorgeous, but we would have these battles over philosophy versus theology, basically. And I would say things like, well, you're so smart. How is it that you can believe this book of fairy tales and superstition? If God is real, he can't be about all of these rules and restrictions. He's got to be about enlightenment, higher vibrations, positive energy, and love. And she said to that, well, that's right. For though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I've become a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. If I have faith to understand, to move mountains, and knowledge to understand all mysteries, if I have not love, it profits me nothing. If I give my goods to feed the poor, my body to be burned, if I have not love, I am nothing. I nodded my head to that and said, that's beautiful. Did you write that? She said, no, fool, that's first grade. And so all that just to say that I found myself through meeting the woman who I would eventually marry and became the mother of my children, challenging myself to read the Bible from cover to cover. And as it came on the other end of a lot of introspective, meditative, and spiritual experiences I began having at that time in my life, I emerged a Christian. She joined the military. We moved from left-leaning Los Angeles to Colorado Springs, which is a military town. We joined a Messianic Jewish synagogue, as a matter of fact, and started worshiping there. And so all of a sudden, in this moment in time where I'm actively studying conservatism, libertarianism, in the interest of bringing people on the right into the Obama movement, I also, in becoming married, and, that tends to make people more conservative. I'm living, all my friends are now religious people, believers in Christ who are culturally Jewish, and then soldiers, right? And so all of this had the effect, I think, of making me far more conservative in my disposition. I just looked up one day and I went down a list of 100 issues. I'm like, holy cow, I'm like right of center on like 62 or 65 things out of 100 at least, And so that's what, that was my journey towards being a sort of conservative. But that journey has continued ever since. And today, again, I still consider myself to be philosophically conservative, but politically I function more as an independent. And so that's probably a well enough place to be.
Your biography definitely resonates in a different generation. I'm a generation older than you are, but I grew up in an assimilated Jewish family. I actually attended an Episcopalian school, grades 9 through 18, coat and tie and everything. But I was very secular, and I went through a process where I re-embraced the Jewish tradition, became what's called an Orthodox Jew. I lived with the Haredim, the dudes who dressed black and white. I moved to Israel, lived with them for 3 years. Without going into details, went from world to world to world. Why am I mentioning this? And I also had 2 friends who I grew up with who went through a similar process, but I definitely felt like what we were doing was an exception to the rule. I would be interested to know if your experience of a return to religion, or return to faith, in your context, was it an exception to the rule? Do you find that this is something today in America that is happening in certain places, or is it still something that's marginal?
Well, that's a great question. I think that in the context of my own family life and social circles, I think that I was something of an exception to the rule. And fortunately, that did not earn me any great hostility from anybody who was particularly important to me in life. They may not have always understood that choice, but generally, I didn't get a lot of hostility from that. I think that while it's probably still a little bit less common to have, although it does happen all the time, but while it's still probably more infrequently the case that people who grow up secular then find themselves becoming very much religious as opposed to the other way around, I do think that there is, on a broader level, a larger shift back in the direction of a generally positive disposition towards the recognized importance of religious life, and maybe even some of the particular values of the Judeo-Christian tradition in the secular West, as a consequence of the fact that I think many people who might consider themselves secular as a general rule, nevertheless perceive in the erosion of the religious foundation of society the opening up of a void into which all sorts of ideological extremism is pouring in. And that this is a grossly damaging thing for modern society, that even if you put aside the ideological warping of many groups of people, is still is still occasioning an increase in social disconnection, loneliness, an absence of greater purpose in life that's simply not necessarily satisfied just by a glut of technology or even material prosperity. I think that there is a spiritual hollowness that many people recognize in the modern West, which is causing a lot of people to reevaluate the quickness with which many of us may have discarded religion as something that was important. And I think that this accounts really for the tremendous popularity of Jordan Peterson over the years. I think you see an acute example, and she, I think, seems to be in the midst of a very serious conversion, but in the turn from really new atheism towards faith that we're observing in Ayaan Hirsi Ali at the present moment. Um, so yeah, there is a shift back in that direction. It's not quite as cut and dry as people who grew up secular suddenly en masse becoming Catholic or Baptist or something like that.
Right.
But it is, I think, an effort to try and understand, how we can preserve, how we can conserve what may be the indispensable cultural and moral and social foundations provided by religion in an age where we may be experiencing the consequences of having dispensed with some of those things too soon. So I think that that's what we're seeing in more general terms.
I'm going to take a page from Aryeh's book and say something about my own religious background and circle back to you, John. When I was a teenager, at the age of 15, which would have been in 1978, I went through a Christian experience. Now, there were things going on in my life and my family that I think were part of the existential crisis I was going through at the time, but it was very powerful for me. And it laid a real foundation of a grounding in the Black American Christian tradition, which I grew up, on my mother's side, it was Pentecostal holiness. On my dad's side, it was AME, African Methodist Episcopal. Yeah. So I went much deeper in terms of reading the scriptures and going to church. And so it laid a strong foundation for me. And as far as like a conservative perspective, my first exposure, of course, being aware of politics growing up, you look at the news and this type of thing. But I worked for the broadcast journalist Tony Brown, host for several decades of Tony Brown's Journal, which was kind of the longest running Black American public affairs show at the time, from the late 60s through the 90s, I would say. And he, while I was working with him, starting in like mid 80s, he consciously converted, not religiously, but became a Republican. And he did it, he says, based on the principle of there was so much focus among Black Americans to the Democratic Party that we just gave them our vote and weren't really getting much in return, or as much as we could get in return, if we didn't strategically spread our vote to be able to have leverage within both parties. So that was my first exposure to that. As far, I'll just state this without going into detail. As far as my own political stance, I'm an independent also, but I consider myself a radical moderate. I just want to state that for the record. Aryeh, you want to say something?
Yeah, we have. I would like to ask a question to the two of you, please. We already have a thinker like Tocqueville who talked about how important for the health of American democracy that you have institutions that mediate between the individual and the state, voluntary associations. Now, you're both are talking about religion, and John, you're talking in particular about the church. We had Henry Louis Gates Jr. as a guest, and he talked about the importance of the church, and he's done a tremendous amount of work on, both on his, I think, a
documentary series,
and the book which I have on the Black church, which I've read. But do you think, gentlemen, that that one of the priorities should be? Would you like to see a strengthened church, a church that is more assertive as a mediating institution where people can come together, where values can be instilled, where part of the heritage can be passed on? Is this something that you think is a need for American democracy?
I'll go first, if you don't mind, John, because you've already riffed on what that vacuum has created in America, generally speaking, and particularly in terms of Black American culture and community. Certainly, the church was the fount of so much of our lives, so much of our leadership. Henry Louis Gates went into some detail to talk about how when we were dealing with the during Jim Crow in the post-Reconstruction era, how the church was the one place that we could really preserve dignity in so many ways and exercise leadership in various ways. So I would just say, Aryeh, that I think the church still does play a powerful role in Black American life, though not as strong as it once did. And I think that properly conceived, it could continue playing that mediating role.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Greg, I think Greg captured plenty of it. I guess the thing that I would add, because on the one hand, I think that the social utility of the church is clear, and it has precisely the historic cultural role that Greg and I think Henry Louis Gates articulate with respect to the particular function it served within the Black community over time. And of course, it has also been a vehicle of social progress and social activism in a way that makes the Black church experience in America somewhat distinct from the white church. However, what's also true is that at least in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, and perhaps somewhat in response to it, although I don't want to reduce it to this, but with the rise of the moral majority and Jerry Falwell and the evangelical coalition that lifted Ronald Reagan to office, you sort of saw the political mobilization of white conservative evangelical America in a way that I think, and this goes for both Black and white, left and right. There's a double-edged sword to the political engagement of the church, because on the one hand, I do think it's important for the church to be able to stand up for its own values. And I don't have a problem with churches being engaged in the democratic discourse, but hopefully not at the expense of its ability to effectively provide an inclusive and socially harmonizing communal structure, which allows us to be able to hopefully engage in our differences in a transcendent spirit of agape love and goodwill. But B, and just building on that point, that allows for it to still serve a spiritual function. See, that's the thing. I am still very much weary of religion absent the Holy Spirit. I'm still very much weary of people dressed in fine religious garments who internally are possessed of dry bones. And I think that too much of religion, generally speaking, and too much of religion that you might observe in America today has become politicized and bastardized without attention to the first fruits of religious experience, which should be a relationship with God and a disposition that allows you to love your neighbor as yourself. That shouldn't be a platitude. That should be a deep and disciplined way of life that leads you to aspire to higher ways of being in the world, to being Christ-like if you're a Christian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So yeah, that's the sort of religion that I think we need. There's a lot of there's real double-edged sword to much of the rest.
I think that what you're pointing to in terms of the double-edged sword, the danger in religion is a real thing. Within the Jewish tradition itself, in the Gemara, the Torah is called a Sam Hayim and it's called a Sam Mavet. It can be an elixir of life and it can be a death potion, because the approach and the intention are fundamental. And I think that you're seeing in the Middle East, the dangers of a politicized religion are there for all to see. If we can segue on that note into a question about democratic discourse in America, is that okay, Greg?
Oh, of course.
Okay.
I wanted to make sure since we were talking about Black American religion, I wanted to make sure to bring in Dr. King and counterpose that to anti-racism, which takes a different ideological approach. So if you could keep your thought in that question, Aryeh,
Sure.
if you wouldn't mind, in that same vein of talking about the Black American church and politics. In America, there's a separation between church and state, but because of the history and social and religious trajectory of Black American life, the role of the church in political movements have been necessary. And Dr. King is is representative of that,
Right.
as it was many organizations during the civil rights era. So can you riff on that and counterpose the distinction between Dr. King's approach and what we can call, say, contemporary anti-racist ideology?
Mhm. Right. Well, yeah. So there is, first of all, I think it is vital for us to remember that with respect to Martin Luther King Jr., though we do an abundant, I think, an abundant sort of job in remembering him through iconography and celebrating his political and social achievements as an activist. Just in general in American society, we tend to forget that Martin Luther King Jr. really was a systemic moral philosopher. And the work of the civil rights movement, but more specifically the nonviolent movement, which was a movement within a movement, of course, that he was the spear tip of as his lead representative, was a movement based in a worldview which was not just about achieving legal equality, but was also about aspiring towards the highest possible conception of human life, one that rested on the presupposition that all human beings are inherently worthy of dignity, made in the image of God, and that what we were really on about with this nonviolent stuff was to try and move beyond thingifying each other, to see the thou as opposed to the thingness of other human beings. And so the philosophical nonviolence, the Kingian tradition, rests upon the idea that love, agape love, which you can translate as goodwill, but agape is the term that King used, was a spiritual force that could affect social transformation. And as such, that attitude permeated the methodology of the nonviolent movement with respect to protests, demonstrations. It was all an effort of calling people into a humanizing conversation, speaking to the conscience of the opposition, and allowing them to see that those who fought for genuine justice and equality in America were not their enemies, but were aspiring to win their trust and friendship so that we could share community together on the other side of our moral battles for dignity and justice and equality in American life, right? So there's a real way in which the movement King led was aimed at the spiritual liberation of the oppressor. And I think that it is in that you see a marked contrast between that culture of activism. And by the way, that culture of activism itself is very much different from what other groups were doing at the time, of course. But there's a particular distinction to be made between that and the anti-racism that is in vogue in our present time. Because I think that what you see mobilized in the current moment, whether you're looking at the sorts of protests we saw during the Black Lives Matter movement in summer of 2020, or the sort of application of a lot of anti-racist perspective through a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and or just sort of the ideological output of folks like Robin DiAngelo, and though I actually prefer him much more in comparison to DiAngelo, but Ibram X. Kendi and many others, is, I think, a focus on sort of muscularly insisting that America, and particularly white patriarchal America, recognize not only its own power and privilege, but accept its own internal and implicit bias, and accept the perceived reality that all of the structures and institutions of American society, historically and contemporaneously, have evolved and been arranged for the express purpose of marginalizing people of color, particularly Black people in America, and further empowering the white majority that seeded these institutions in the first place. Now, truth be told, I think that if Dr. King were alive today, he would probably, it's very possible that he would feel that the gains made by the civil rights movement were grossly insufficient, that there's still a great deal of racial disparity baked into the impact of a lot of our institutions. It's possible that King would have some sympathies with a lot of what the third wave anti-racist folks feel. But the big difference is that Dr. King was not seeking to make an enemy out of the right, out of white people. He was not seeking to sort of hammer them into contrition through the blunt force of ideology. He was seeking to win over their conscience through the loving art of moral persuasion, while not sacrificing an ounce of passion or conviction or intensity in how he made that case. He was always trying to speak to the heart of the opposition. But you can only do that if you're coming from a spiritually transcendent place. And that's, and it's not just the anti-racist social justice folks of 2024 who are guilty of this. It's a condition of our politics in general that we are not seeking to do that. We are seeking to beat people into submission with ideological arguments that do not take into account their particular experiences and do not seek to make common cause on the basis of shared values. And that's why everything we do in American politics today blows up in all of our faces for the most part. We are not genuinely trying to win each other over because we are not humble enough to try and start by acknowledging the humanity in the other side and signaling goodwill for that humanity. But that was like the foundation of everything that Dr. King did.
Well, I want to lead to what Aryeh was asking. I'm going to hand it over to you, Aryeh, by just saying that Danielle Allen has an essay on Dr. King. You said he was a moral philosopher. She also looked at him as a democratic theorist in some ways.
Absolutely.
So, Aryeh, why don't you continue with what you were going to say before?
You said a lot of really interesting things first, John, a lot of food for thought. What was the phrase that you used? Trying to, from this transcendent perspective, trying to win people over through the loving art of moral persuasion? Is that the right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Moral suasion.
Moral suasion.
Moral suasion.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. And Ibram X. Kendi, just to take him as an example, adamantly does not believe in the effectiveness of moral suasion. And he argues in How to Be an Anti-Racist that really the cultural shifts of the civil rights movement were not the product of moral suasion, but rather to the degree to which you had cultural change come about in America in the aftermath of those things. It's simply because the white majority saw that once you allowed Black people to eat at lunch counters, the world did not end. It wasn't really so bad. But that sort of ignores the fact that the multicultural cross-partisan coalition that allowed for those changes to take place had to be forged through an effective campaign of moral suasion to begin with, right, in addition to boycotts and the hard-nosed tactics. But moral cultural persuasion was foundational to establishing a coalition that allowed for those bills to be passed to begin with.
Okay. So what do you do then? We, in our conversation with Monica Guzman and Angel Eduardo, we had a discussion about free speech and democratic conversation. And the question, what we touched upon in that conversation, and the question I'd like to pose to you is, what do you do when you are talking to people? Or do you recognize that there are some people with whom the attempt to persuade on reasonable grounds, infused by a moral intensity or a moral, infused with goodwill, it can't work. And it's something that's beyond, even if we begin with the premise that every human being is created in the image of God, even if we begin with the premise that every human being has a conscience, sometimes we are dealing with groups based on ideological grounds, not genetic grounds, not biological grounds, ideological grounds, which baked into their worldview that they can't listen. So, for instance, you could make the Islamist position, and to be clear, we're not talking about all Muslims. There are, scores of schools and branches of Islam, but one of those branches, the Islamist branch, has a vision of sovereignty and the meaning of God's sovereignty, and that if you obey, this is explicit Islamist literature. If you willingly obey the laws consciously of another country, in a way you are not in a way in the simple sense, you are an idolater, because you are impinging upon God's sovereignty. There's no way to include someone with that view in the democratic process. There's no way of engaging in a conversation when they believe, if you don't begin with the premise of their revealed scripture, that you belong to the world of Jahiliyyah, you belong to the world of ignorance. If that's their beginning premise. Likewise, if you're talking to people on the hardcore post-colonial left who believe that there is no objective reality, that the fundamental reality is perspectival and relative. So my first move is going to have to be to interpret. And whatever you say, I'm going to interpret in light of the premise of how the world is, especially if it's broken down into oppressors and oppressed, that I'm beginning with. Everything that you then say is just a justification of your position. It's like trying to convince someone who's paranoid of your goodwill. Everything that you say and do is going to be registered through that prism. You have groups within American society, it would seem, that this model is going to have difficulty when it comes up against that wall.
Right. Well, Bayard Rustin, of course, said that some words along the lines of 25% of the people, with respect to the civil rights movement, will never be with us. 25% of the people are already with us. It's the 50% in the middle that we need to be focused on.
That robust cultural and political center.
Well, precisely. So that I think gives you a sense of where at least one of King's tutors in nonviolence, Bayard Rustin, would have come from as a practical matter. And you know what? I do think, Aryeh, that you're not wrong, but that part of the issue actually is just sort of a practical one. But I am less an authority on the breadth of radical Islamic ideology than you yourself are likely to be. But I do imagine that if you were to take somebody who was raised in the sort of cultural universe of Hamas, let's say, as radicalized as that individual might be, but if over an extended period of time you were able to, by some miracle, bring them over the course of weeks or months or years into conversation with Jewish people who could demonstrate their goodness, demonstrate their humanity, allow him to see the cultural renaissance that unfolds around the music that we share in America, across lines of faith, across lines of race, that allows him to come into contact with other Muslims who have an interpretation of his same sacred texts that speak to a transcendent spiritualism, that speak to a vision of God, a vision of Allah that is rooted in conscience, rooted in love. If you allow them to taste the fruits of the Spirit in their entirety, you would at least maximize the power and the capacity of love to be able to transform a person over time. And every now and again, you'll come into contact. I mean, Majid Nawaz comes to mind, whatever you think of his latter politics, but there are certainly people we can point to who have come out of the world of Islamic extremism, just as they've come out of the world of neo-Nazism and white nationalism and other radical, dehumanizing and even murderous movements, to be able to achieve a complete transformation of conscience. The problem is that, well, you just can't do that for very many people. So the circumstances that allow for that sort of conversion to happen sometimes are just like the stars aligning, right? I think, though, that as a general matter, what King would have said is that the power of nonviolence is twofold, in that on the one hand, through nonviolence, through genuinely loving your enemies. And by the way, Jesus loved his enemies and was crucified, right? It wasn't as if Jesus himself won over most people in his time. He did not. But there are two things that are powerful here. One is that on the one hand, you maximize your ability through love to speak to the conscience of the opposition. But even if you fail to do so, you do manage to remove from yourself the albatross of fear, of contempt, of hatred, that is itself an internal spiritual albatross, an internal curse on the spiritual life of yourself as an individual.
So,
Because even if you kill it in the flesh, if you, and this is, part of the power, of course, of
Is that your children we're hearing, John?
no, those are other kids. There's a kids playing outside.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm sorry.
I am in a classroom, and ironically enough,
Okay.
there are no kids.
Okay.
There are no kids.
All right.
But and perhaps this is a luxury in part of Christian metaphysics. But if you do believe that the life of the soul is more important than the life of the flesh, then part of what that gives you is a capacity to commit to the flourishing of your conscience, regardless of what happens in the outside world. And what that does is it sows the seeds of a new perspective in the people who are touched by that, such that even to roughly paraphrase Dr. King, even while Christ in his time occupied a cross and Caesar a throne, that over the greater arc of time, the life of Caesar would have to be dated by the sacrifice of that very Jewish rabbi who was sacrificed on that cross, right? In the larger arc of time, the seeds of goodwill that we sow ripple out in the way of thinking that winds up permeating the world in the ages to come.
Right.
So you have to have that deep a commitment to it to see it fully blossom.
I have two points. One is small and pedantic, the other is large. The small pedantic point is you don't have to say Jewish rabbi.
It's kind of like saying what's your dad's name, John?
That's right. The second point is I do think that you have to be careful about projecting the American Christian experience onto other religious experiences. The experiences and the traditions are so particular. And I understand what you're saying about trying to use this method of reaching the higher, of channeling your own higher self and thereby connecting it to others. And you need the alignment of the stars. And I understand that and the depth of it. And I understand that it has a track record in the United States. I do think that the contexts that we're talking about are so radically different. And the mindset is so radically different. I do think it's instructive, this conversation. I definitely believe would be, I think it's important. And more and more Muslims are moving to America. And from a purely American perspective, knowledge of Islam it can be both necessary and good in terms of the varieties of Islam and the different types of Muslims. And I think the people who would agree first, most enthusiastically with that point, would be the liberal, open, tolerant Muslims in America.
Well, let me just say this. The first time I actually became aware of you, John, was seeing you, if I'm not mistaken, seeing you as a guest with Glenn Lowry on Glenn Lowry's show. And I remember Glenn went on this riff, this really passionate, visceral riff against, kind of the radical left and anti-racist, if I remember correctly. And he took you to task. And I remember very distinctly how you not only kept your calm, but how you channeled some of the shared religious and spiritual background that you two have. And it caused him to really, kind of go within at that moment and back down a little bit and say, I probably need to go to church a little more. So I was very impressed with your actual use of your faith, and also reminding him, remember, I ran against Maxine Waters. So, realize who you're talking to here. But I want to, kind of round the bend to our end by ending with where we began and where you began. You mentioned the phrase Omni-American. So tell us what being an Omni-American means to you.
Well, I may not capture the quote well, but Greg, you will likely correct me. But I first came into contact with the concept of the Omni-American not too long before you and I really got to know each other, Greg, through the work of Alistair McIntyre. the great philosopher and virtue ethicist who wrote After Virtue and other things. And if I recall correctly, McIntyre, who, I mean, you could easily argue is one of the preeminent philosophers of all time, is a thinker about morality and virtue, identified Albert Murray as basically that to him.
Albert Murray is possibly, in my view, the most important American writer of the late 20th century.
He seized upon this idea of the Omni-American. I remember him quoting Albert Murray along the lines of saying that you do not know yourself as American unless you know yourself as a Midwesterner, unless you know yourself as a New England Yankee, unless you understand yourself as a white Southerner, unless you know yourself as an African American. And that thesis statement right there captures for me the true American dream, both as an individual and also as a social whole. I think that there are a couple of ways to go wrong in our understanding of what it means to be an American. And of course, they sort of mirror each other a bit. On the one hand, we can be racial or ideological identitarians and say, well, there's a pure way of being American. You know, you have to be white, or maybe you just have to be a traditional conservative or one thing or another. And that is a problem. There's also a sort of multiculturalism, however, in America, which really, in my view, is less multiculturalism and more multicolorism in some sense. There's a way in which a certain perspective wishes to genericize ideologically all American thinking in a way that highlights a diversity that really only exists on an aesthetic level, but folds us all in to a sort of left-leaning perspective on the world, which oftentimes flattens out the truly transcendent and the truly culturally distinct and diverse. I think that the concept of the Omni-American, as I understand it, allows for a recognition of ourselves as Americans as being made up of distinct and valuable traditions, cultures, and experiences that do not lose themselves in the homogenizing press of multiculturalism, but that nevertheless combine to become something that are greater than the sum of its parts. And in that, Greg and Aryeh, I'm able to look at you guys as kin in an American context, because while we've walked our different paths, we do overlap each other in having a deep relationship to all of these distinct traditions. I mean, each of us has been influenced by Black culture, by jazz, by Jewish culture, by the legacy of the founding. By all of these different things that, even though, you know, where we come from on the map, our racial composition is all differentiated. There's an alchemy of cultural magic that produces who we are as individuals and to each other as Americans. And I think that the Omni-American framework is the only one I've ever really heard articulated that fully captures that, I think, in its philosophical nuance. And so, you know, that is a legacy that, as I said at the very start of our conversation, must be made more visible and must be upheld.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us today, John. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching us on Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast.
Subscribe today and fight for a future in which the many join as one against bigotry.